Good afternoon. You're watching the English newscast on Future Television. I'm Yumna Naufal, and these are today's top stories. A woman blows herself up and a suspected jihadist is killed during a huge police assault in Paris, targeting the masterminds of last week's attacks. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says the West has to drop its demands about the political exit of Syrian President Bashar Assad if it wants a genuinely international coalition. U.S. lawmakers call for even tighter scrutiny of Syrian refugees fleeing to the United States as last week's Paris attacks recast America's debate over immigration. Good afternoon to our viewers. A woman blew herself up and a suspected jihadist was killed during a huge police assault in Paris targeting the suspected mastermind of last week's attacks in the capital. Gunfire and explosions rocked the Saint-Denis area in the north of the capital near the Stade de France Stadium from before dawn as terrified residents were evacuated or told to stay in their homes. Authorities arrested 7 people while 5 police officers suffered minor injuries in the operation, which turned into a 7-hour standoff between security forces and a group of people holed up in an apartment. Paris prosecutor François Molins said telephone surveillance and witness reports led them to believe that Abdelhamid Baoud, the suspected mastermind of Friday's series of attacks in Paris that killed 129, had been in the apartment. So, Turkish police detained 8 suspected members of the Islamic State group, also known as ISIS, according to state media, adding that they were planning to sneak into Europe posing as refugees. Counter-terror police detained the suspects in Istanbul's Ataturk airport after they flew in from the Moroccan city of Casablanca on Tuesday. Now, the police found a handwritten note on one of the suspects detailing a migration route to go from Istanbul to Germany, of course, starting in Syria via Greece, Serbia, and Hungary, which also included smuggler boats across the Mediterranean Sea. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says the West has to drop its demands about the political exit of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad if it wants a genuinely international coalition against ISIS. Lavrov said that there was still no agreement about Assad's political fate after international talks in Vienna said he had detected a change in the West's position since the Paris attacks and the bombing of a Russian passenger plane. Russia, which views Syria as its closest Middle East ally, has long been at odds with the West over Assad's future with Moscow, saying only the Syrian people should decide if he steps down. The United States and others want Assad to step aside during or at the end of a transition period. Now, after strikes increased following last week's attacks in Paris, French and Russian airstrikes in northern Syria have killed at least 33 extremists with the Islamic State group in the last 72 hours, leading to the death of dozens of ISIS fighters that were wounded in the attack on the extremist de facto Syrian capital of Raqqa. This comes as Al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate Al-Nusra Front says it has downed 2 Russian reconnaissance drones over a military airport it controlled in northwestern Syria. If confirmed, the incident would be the first time that the armed opposition downed a Russian aircraft since Moscow launched strikes in Syria on September 30th. Al-Nusra, in a post late on Tuesday on one of its official Syrian Twitter accounts, claimed the downing of 2 Russian drones over Abu Duhur military airport in Idlib. The group also posted a picture of wreckage in a large plane, as well as 2 others of a small plane on fire with larger military aircraft parked in the background. Speaker Nabih Berri is calling on the international community to form a united front to combat ISIS in the wake of the Beirut and the Paris attacks. Terrorism, he said, has become a security threat to the entire world. He told this to lawmakers at his weekly meeting, saying it was essential to create a global front to fight ISIS and terrorism, since terrorism is not limited to a country or a region. Berri's call also comes after 46 people were killed and more than 200 wounded in a twin suicide attack in the Beirut suburb of Burj Brajne last week. Coming up next, more headlines when we return. Welcome back. You're watching the 4:20 o'clock news here on Future Television. Lebanon's famous Pigeon Rock, as it is called in English, located along the Beirut coastline, will be illuminated with the Lebanese and French flags in a tribute to the victims of the recent ISIS-claimed attacks in Beirut, as well in Paris. The rock, more commonly known as Rauche, was briefly illuminated on Tuesday night in an apparent test ahead of a ceremony to be held this evening at 6:30 p.m. in the presence of French Ambassador to Lebanon Emmanuel Bonne, Beirut lawmakers, and members of the Municipal Council. The event, organized by Beirut Governor Ziad Shabib, comes in light of similar solidarity campaigns all around the world. U.S. lawmakers are calling for even tighter scrutiny over Syrian refugees fleeing to the United States as last week's deadly Paris attacks recast America's debate over immigration and national security, prompting a sharp rebuke from President Barack Obama, who said attempts to block entry were offensive and contrary to American values.
We are not well served when, in response to a terrorist attack, we descend into fear and panic. We don't make good decisions if it's based on hysteria or an exaggeration of risks. And I think the refugee debate is an example of us not being well served by some of the commentary that's been taking place by officials back home and in the media. We're welcome, we're open to hearing actual ideas, but that's not really what's been going on in this debate. When candidates say we wouldn't admit 3-year-old orphans, that's political posturing. When individuals say that we should have a religious test and that only Christians, proven Christians, should be admitted, that's offensive and contrary to American values. I cannot think of a more potent recruitment tool for ISIL than some of the rhetoric that's been coming out of here during the course of this debate. From the start, I've also welcomed Moscow going after ISIL. The problem has been that in their initial military incursion into Syria, they've been more focused on propping up Mr. Assad and targeting the moderate opposition, as opposed to targeting those folks who threaten us, Europe, and Russia as well. And I've had repeated discussions, first in New York at the United Nations General Assembly, and then most recently in Turkey with President Putin, that if in fact he shifts his focus and the focus of his military to what is the principal threat, which is ISIL, then that is something that we very much want to see. That's not how they've been operating over the last several weeks. It may be that now, having seen ISIL take down one of their airliners in a horrific accident, that reorientation continues. And we'll be in discussions with Moscow and Mr. Putin to see if that will continue.
Echoing the words of President Barack Obama, U.S. Democratic presidential frontrunner Hillary Clinton says she is willing to accept refugees. She's a former Secretary of State, and she told a rally in Dallas, Texas, that refugees should be, of course, meticulously screened. Of course, this comes after the deadly attacks in Paris pushed terrorism and the Syrian refugee crisis to the center of the U.S. presidential campaign.
If you listen to a lot of the commentary about what's going on with these terrible attacks in Paris, you know, you hear a lot about how the people who are living there left to go fight. They went to go fight in Syria. Thousands of them from France and Belgium and England and other places in Europe. We don't have that problem here. Now, we may have some other challenging issues with terrorism, and we have to be vigilant and strong, but part of the reason is because we have always welcomed immigrants and refugees, and we have made people feel that if they did their part, they sent their kids to school, they worked hard, there'd be a place for them in America. And now, you know, with this new refugee crisis, of course we have to have a lot of vigilance, and we have to vet people, and I would depend upon our defense and intelligence professionals to guide us in doing that. But we can't act as though we're shutting the doors to people in need without undermining who we are as Americans and the values we have stood for.
We're going to go to our next clip now. Eddie Redmayne, last year's Best Oscar winner for Best Actor, who won for The State of Everything, is talking about transvestites and how they are regarded in the United States, as his new movie, The Danish Girl, is to be released in theaters this winter.
And some of the things that they have to go through as a couple, but also that Lily specifically has to go through, of violence, discrimination, almost 100 years on from that story. Those things haven't necessarily changed. There is a huge amount of job discrimination and discrimination generally against trans people, and a huge amount of violence, particularly for trans women of colour, and so it's kind of shocking that there hasn't been as much progress in that amount of time. The first time I walked on set, I felt scrutinised. I felt the gaze of other people, and I felt nervous. And I don't know whether I was projecting the being looked at, but it was interesting because it was something that a lot of the women I've met and had spoken about. And what I learnt from this experience is that gender is fluid in the way that sexuality is fluid, and we have bits of everything in us. How's my life changed? Do you know, the thing with it is I've kind of been working quite intensively, so it's been a frenzied, wonderful time, but I haven't really had respite to get perspective on it. I'm just sort of putting one foot in front of the other, and knowing that I'm incredibly lucky, and that it'll all come to a crushing end soon. So I'm trying to sort of just keep my head afloat, really.
Now we would go back live to the broadcast of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon.